morning to you, and thank you so much for your time. And I realize that because of a time change, it's probably late night in the United States. But that's the reality of living on the globe.
Не за что.
Uh,
Большое спасибо.
Ray, that's an experience to talk in front of the United Nations Security Council. And although you've been supported by a friend of yours, one of the greatest journalists of our times, Seymour Hersh, but it's still probably, it's quite an experience. How was it?
That's quite right. That was my first time testifying at the UN Security Council, but I've walked into many an Oval Office meeting, and so it was par for the course. You gear yourself up, you know what you're going to say, and you try your best to say it in not only an ideal way with ideas, but also from the heart, which I tried to do at the Security Council.
But it looks like not everyone was willing to hear, so it's quite an unusual situation when people do not care what actually happened. They don't want the truth. They want their version of the events.
It was quite remarkable. Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia attested before I did, and he pointed out that such investigations of the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines, such investigations that have taken place, namely the Swedish one, well, the Swedes went down there in the water and they know that territory, and they came up and people say, well, what did you find? And they said, we can't tell you. Oh, God. They couldn't tell their Swedish citizens. They couldn't tell their allies. I wonder what they found. So the idea that the United Nations Security Council would take this up, well, if they wouldn't take it up, then what good? What good is the United Nations Security Council? The interesting thing was that I was waiting for the Chinese representative to speak, and he fully supported the Russian position, saying, look, if the Security Council is worth its salt, so to speak, and turns down the requirement to investigate this bombshell incident, this provocation, this sabotage between countries, then what good is the United Nations Security Council? So the Chinese fully supported the resolution. The others hummed and hawed and read from their notes. Nobody seemed to be paying attention to me or to Jeffrey Sachs, but the proof was in the pudding. It will be interesting to see how this comes out. I was very, very interested in the fact that over the weekend, on Saturday, there were 50,000 people demonstrating in Berlin, and I expect that the Germans and others will finally wake up and say, well, when Olaf Scholz, Chancellor Scholz, was there with President Biden, and Biden said that we can and we will destroy the pipeline if there's a Russian invasion, Scholz was asked what he thought of that, and he said, we do everything together. We do things together. There's nothing we do that we don't do together. So the Germans have a right to ask Chancellor Scholz, did you do this together with the United States, or were you surprised? Either way, it's not a very pretty picture.
Yeah, alle zusammen. We do all together.
Alle zusammen.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Alle zusammen. Well, we'll see. We'll see if alle zusammen.
One should imagine that there will be a line of journalists from BBC, CNN, New York Times willing to talk to you after the quite an experience of talking in front of the United Nations Security Council. But it looks like BBC was much more interested in covering the story of UN meeting condemning Russia. Are they trying to say that you do not exist? So they, partially blinded.
Well, I've been banned from the mainstream media, so-called. My last piece in the Washington Post was a response to Senator McCain, who said that the annexation of Crimea was unprovoked. Got that word? Unprovoked. And I mentioned that when McCain wrote his article, he didn't mention the coup in Kiev on the 22nd of February before. It was that not provocation enough? So they haven't let me in the newspaper lately. One has to go to my website, raymcgovern.com, to see what I'm saying or see what I'm writing or see the interviews that I do. I would note one thing that I had a very interesting interview this morning with Chinese TV. They are interested, and it's to their credit that they seem to want to get the full story from the likes of me and from others who pretend to know what's going on.
But it looks like not everyone in the United States are out of their mind, because I'm not sure that I'm doctor enough to judge mental health of United States political leaders, but Donald Trump definitely seems to be much more rational than Joe Biden. At least he's saying that, come on, guys, of course we could do that. Of course we could do that. Or Ukraine, or some other, but definitely not Russia. They have zero interest in doing that. So come on, at least be reasonable.
Well, the initial reaction, as you know, Vladimir, was the Russians did it. John Brennan, former CIA director, it was the Russians. It was the Russians. General Jack Keane, there's no evidence, but it must have been the Russians. It was laughable. Okay, now they're off that because it just was too much of a stretch to say that the Russians would shoot themselves in their own foot. So what do they say now? Well, we just don't know, and we're gonna try to rely on the Danes and the Swedes and the Norwegians. Norwegians were involved, according to Hirsch, and the Germans. The idea that we would leave it to those folks who were, in fact, some of them the victims themselves, you'd think that they would want to get to the bottom of it. But Olaf Scholz, the chancellor in Germany, doesn't seem to be all that interested. To their credit, the Chinese do seem interested. And of course, that's the tectonic shift in the world correlation of forces that Ukraine has catalyzed. You have China and Russia. The old triangular relationship used to be equilateral. Now it's isosceles with the U.S. on the short end. And whose fault is that? These geniuses that are running President Biden's foreign policy.
Definitely not President Biden himself, because obviously he's not in a position even to realize what country he's in and what words he has to pronounce. Actually, it looks a bit... no, I feel even pity for the guy. That's not the best way to meet the autumn of life. Not the best way.
The ends, yeah. Yeah, I share that sympathy. I'm just a year or two older than Biden. I think I'm in more control of my faculties.
No doubt.
I have a better memory and I know where I'm walking usually. And so it's a sad spectacle, but more important than sad, Vladimir, is who is making these decisions? Now,
that's
Mr.
a very
Putin
good question.
has said that there's you said sumashchi, out of their minds. Okay, well, Mr. Putin said crazy. He was asked at Valdai in October. He was asked, "How do you think why are the Americans taking on China At the same time, they're taking on us in Ukraine. Why is that going on? And Mr. Putin said, you know, I used to think there was some subtle plan here, but I no longer think so. I think they're just crazy, is the word he used. Okay, and then he said, it's just simple arrogance. It's a feeling of impunity. Oh, I think that is correct. So if you have a feeling of impunity and you think you're exceptional and you're very well educated, well, what are you inclined to advise President Biden to do? He has already done some very, very dumb things. Worst come to worst, one has to be worried about what else he'll be prompted to do for whatever reason, for electoral reasons. Domestic politics, of course, enters into this equation.
You mentioned, well, I mentioned basically, based on your biography, that part of your job as CIA analyst was to read thoroughly and listen thoroughly to Soviet speeches to squeeze them, to squeeze the juice out of them, the essence. So, what's your
That's
take
right.
on Putin's last speech?
I think it was very definitive. I think that that speech and the Chinese document that was issued over the weekend really set the stage for what's in the offing now. They came out on the same end of things. I think that's the big story. Mr. Putin said some really, really very candid things, and it looks like he and his associates pretty much given up on following Peter the Great's example of looking west. Um, there's nothing for them to the west. They're going to look east, and so сюда грозит мы будем шведу. Well, they're gonna threaten the Swedes simply by turning east and finding a gracious, I would say, a very fraternal reception by most of the rest of the world. And that's what it's come down to, Vladimir. What we have here is the lily white West embodied in NATO. Look at them all. They're all white, okay? The Turks are the closest you get to people of color against the rest of the world, primarily people of color, China, India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Iran. So for the US policymakers to have the idea, if they really believe it, that we have isolated Russia, well, yeah, right. You've isolated Russia into the hands of 1.4 billion Chinese, 1.5 billion Indians, and the rest of the world, which is 80% people of color. That's not a healthy relationship. That's not a healthy division of the world. I see it as bipolar, and I say bipolar in both senses of the word, the psychiatric as well as the strategic.
But it looks like we are facing the reality of almost inevitable nuclear war. Because in the United States political circles, they have this weird point of view on Russia that Russia will never use nuclear weapon and we can do whatever we like and we can send as many and whatever kind of weapon NATO has and we will just destroy Russia. We'll strategically destroy Russia once and for good. They do not read our president right. They do not have any understanding of Russian people. They judge Russians by little shitty motherfuckers, excuse my French, that escaped Russia and now just, open their mouth in order to say ugly words about motherland.
Well, push is going to come to shove, as we say, this spring. Actually, maybe in just one more month. You're just back from the front, so you will know better than I. But our military experts fully expect the offensive to begin like right now. and for Russian forces to reach the Dnieper in another month or so. Then the time will come for really thinking about ending this thing with some kind of deal, some kind of compromise. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not think that Russia wants to occupy all of Ukraine. I think that would be, take it from me, I think that's something stupid like Cheney or Rumsfeld would do. I do think that the Russians are hell bent on protecting Russian speaking people in Ukraine. And I think they would make a deal. President Putin, you may know this, at Valdai, same speech, October 27, I believe it was asked a question toward the end. It was a correspondent. He said, I'm thinking of traveling to Odessa. Do you think I should apply for a Ukrainian or a Russian visa? Pretty clever, huh? And Mr. Putin said, well, Odessa is a beautiful city. It could be a Yabloko Razdora, an apple of discord, and you know the mythology behind that, the Trojan Wars, or it could be a way to negotiate, a way to see each other as people where you could come to a reasonable agreement. That was amazing to me. That seemed to be a real hidden, not so hidden overture. I never saw anything about it in the U.S. press, and I'm willing to think that no one told Blinken or Biden or Sullivan or anybody important that here they had the equivalent of an overture. They really ought to take it up, because without Odessa, Ukraine is just a landlocked. It's a farm. It's a farm for the rest of Europe. Okay, with Odessa, you could have some sort of viable country still, because you'd have access to the Black Sea. So I think there are makings of a deal there. The question is, do Russian forces have to go all the way up to the Dnieper to include Odessa, or will Washington come to its senses and say, well, all right, this was not a really good idea. We don't want to look at the prospect of the use of nuclear weapons. That's the only thing we have. We don't want to do that, so let's make a deal. And then they will just tell Zelensky, look, do this, and he will salute and say, yes, sir. That's my take on this. What is yours, Vladimir?
I would say that the major problem is that there is no one in the United States whom we can trust, because our history of relationship with the United States, that U.S., even when they give promises, they never come through with the promises. So we have zero trust. The only one whom we can trust is our military, is our men in uniform. And we won't tell them right now, oh, by the way, it looks like we can cut a peace deal. No more peace deals. So at first we have to win. Occupation, never our word. Liberation of historic Russian land and protecting Russian people, doesn't matter where they live, yes, that's our aim, and definitely we will succeed. It may take longer than we expect, but that's the only way we can survive, because it looks like the whole world is trying, Western world is trying to say that let's finally get rid of Russian plague. What words are they using against Russians? So the same words that Germans used to use against Jews.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Ray, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, you do have some real pain in Europe now because of the sanctions and because of the lack of Nord Stream. So I think there's an element there where Macron and maybe Scholz would see their way clear to leaning on Zelensky and saying, look, maybe it's time to deal, and then they'd have to get Washington to say okay. So what I see is that
Ray, they cannot reason Zelensky. Zelensky is another type of psycho. He is an actor that is playing his best role ever. his dream role. They will have to take
He's
care of
really,
him in some weird ways. They won't deal with him.
he's real. Well, they'll send him to his place there in the Riviera or wherever else he is. But the idea is that, as I see it, it's not a winner take all situation. It's winner indeed, but a winner that probably would be satisfied for security guarantees, perhaps a demilitarized zone along the Dnieper, out of range of long range missile and artillery from Western Ukraine. In other words, I see that there is a possibility there. I've been heartened by Mr. Putin's mention of Odessa because that does seem to be key here. And maybe I'm too hopeful, but I don't see any point in taking or liberating all of Ukraine. That would be trouble deep. That would be getting Russia's
Why just
Vietnam again.
Ukraine? Ray, we can liberate Europe from Nazi as well. We've done it once. We would be glad to repeat it. Well, it takes time, but Scholz definitely is asking for it, as well as Macron. But that's probably another story. Ray, thank you so much, and thank you for your time, and we'll continue little discussions. But